but really glad to be with you this morning, although I must say I had a striking contradiction this morning, which was I stayed at a hotel in Las Vegas, and this morning, for some reason, there were just no cabs there, which just seemed odd for Las Vegas, right? Although one thing that was very much Las Vegas is that there's a liquor store in the baggage claim area of the airport, which just really struck me. But this morning there were no cabs, so I was worried I was going to get here late. So I wound up seeing a limo go by, and I flagged the limo. And so I managed to get a ride from a limo to a food bank to talk about inequality in America. So life is full of interesting contradictions. So again, glad to be with you. What I'm going to do today, I think Lisa asked me to talk a bit about the changing demography in the United States and in Nevada and Las Vegas, the shifting roles of the economy, and in particular the way that people are starting to think about inclusion as being part of an economic strategy, to try to inspire you emotionally to do something about this. She also asked me to talk about the current situation in the Mideast and whether or not ISIL would ever be defeated. She also asked me to predict the future of your housing market, and in particular every one of your houses and your mortgages. And then finally asked me to talk about the future for Miley Cyrus, and I couldn't really figure out all that. So, well, the stock market was pretty crazy yesterday. We'll talk about that. So, so I'm going to just talk about this demography, economy, and society. Before I talk, one thing I always like to tell audiences is that while I'm speaking, my voice might break a little bit. And the reason is not that I'm emotional being with you, although pretty much this is the high point of my week. It's that I have a speech disorder that's called spasmodic dysphonia, where there are spasms around your voice box, and it can sometimes lock up. There's some famous people who also have it. Diane Rehm, who's on NPR, Robert Kennedy Jr., and now me. And I always like to reassure people that it gets treated once a month with Botox. Relaxes the muscles, because that's how we treat everything in Los Angeles. So seems to work. So for some of you, the happiest day of the year is your birthday, or Rosh Hashanah, which just happened, or the end of Ramadan, or Christmas, or for Lisa, I think today is the happiest day of the year, right? Because this thing will be finally done. For someone like me, the happiest day of the year is the day the census releases its statistics. And what was striking when you looked at what the census released, particularly from the 2010 census, was this rapid demographic change in the country as a whole. So in the decade of that census period, the growth rate for Latinos in the United States was 43%. The growth rate for Asian Pacific Islanders was 43%. Remarkable coincidence. The growth rate for African Americans was 11%, and the growth rate for non-Hispanic whites in the United States was just 1%. So 43%, 1%, those are pretty big differences. And it's one of the reasons why on election night in 2012, when President Obama got reelected with 39% of the white vote, and all of those newscasters were slapping their foreheads going, "The country's changed, the country's changed." I kept saying, where were you the last couple of years when I was giving talks around the country saying, the country's changed, the country's changed. What's interesting about this demographic change, and we'll see what it looks like in Nevada, is that when most people see, in particular the very high growth rates for Latinos and Asians, what do they think is driving that demographic change? Immigration. And that answer is wrong. Immigration into the country for the last 4 years has slowed down, stabilized, in fact, really reduced. And one of the main reasons for that is that immigration from our largest sending country, Mexico, has been net zero for the last 3 years. That is, there's as many Mexicans returning to Mexico as are crossing the border to come into the United States. In fact, probably one of the reasons why we had that crisis around the unaccompanied minors at the border from Central America is that the coyotes, the people who transport people across the border, are trying to drum up new business now that Mexicans are no longer making a trek in such large numbers. Why is that? Well, it has to do with the fact that the Mexican economy and Latin American economies are doing better than they had in the past. And in fact, they weathered the financial crisis better than we did, particularly better than Las Vegas, by the way. But more fundamentally, it has to do with the fact that fertility rates in Mexico have shifted dramatically. It used to be that over the course of her lifetime, 30, 35 years ago, a woman in Mexico would have 5 children. Now the fertility rate in Mexico is 2.3. The fertility rate in the United States is 1.7. As those two come together, there's less of a push factor from Mexico. And what's driving the overall demographic change in the United States now is births to children of immigrants and not immigration itself. So that's a fundamentally kind of more US-born phenomena, and one we'll get to in a second. Now, this is happening unevenly in different parts of the country because, for example, in Nevada, you're still getting, let's see if this is the right, no, it's the other way. In Nevada, you're still getting quite sharp increases in the Latino population on the order of 82%, the Asian Pacific Island population almost doubling over the last decade, still an increase in the white and African American populations. Las Vegas, also dramatic growth over the last decade in all of those populations. And for you, you're still getting a lot of immigrants because what's gone on is that the traditional receiving areas are no longer receiving as many, and people are hopscotching in new locations. So for example, Los Angeles County, which in the 1980s, it's where I live, Los Angeles County, which in the 1980s received 1/4 of the nation's immigrants, came through LA County. Our share of foreign born has been on the decline for the last 3 years. And there's another really interesting statistic. What do you think is the only large metropolitan area in the United States that did not see an increase in the number of Hispanic children in the last decade? So large metro areas, that's like Las Vegas or Milwaukee or Baltimore or Florida. What is the only large metro area that did not see an increase in the number of Hispanic children? Actually, no. Salt Lake City is on a very dramatic increase in terms of its Latino population. I know, when you think of Salt Lake, I used to think this too. When you think Salt Lake, you think what? White, like super white, right? Because they're Mormon, right? You know, so like they shine, you know. So, and that was true in 1980. It was overwhelmingly white, about 95% white. Salt Lake City is going to become majority minority before the country does. There's been a very rapid influx of immigrants, particularly Latinos, but also Africans and others, into Salt Lake City. It's much more diverse than people think, and they're actually grappling with those kind of issues. So back to the quiz. What's the only large metro area that did not see an increased number of Hispanic children in the last 10 years? Los Angeles. Because LA is kind of coming to the end of a demographic process that you'll see in a minute the rest of the country has really been moving into. So a lot of change, and what this chart shows you, the orange is the growth in the people of color population. The gray is the growth numbers in the white population, and it shows you for the 80s, 90s, and the aughts. And so you can see, as you move from the 80s to the 90s to the aughts, that what's driving the population growth in Las Vegas is people of color now. While there's still, unlike in other places in the United States, a growth in the number of non-Hispanic whites or whites, what's really driving your population growth is this growth in people of color. So that's the next Las Vegas, and it's certainly the next America. And if it's not immigrants driving it, what is driving it? Again, youth. So what this is a chart that shows you the change in the youth population first in the United States, and then we'll look in Las Vegas. So between 2000 and 2010, the number of young whites in the United States actually fell by 4.3 million. Now, I always like to reassure audiences that does not mean that 4.3 million young white people died. We would have noticed that. It would have been reported on Fox News, for sure, blamed on Obamacare even before Obamacare took off, right? And don't worry, I would make fun of MSNBC too if anybody watched them. So what that means is that there's more people moving into 19 and 20 than are moving into 1 and 2, so the net number of young whites falls. The number of young African Americans actually fell in the country by 250,000. Some of that's redesignation into the multiracial category, but actually a lot less than people think, because most young African Americans still wind up marking black on the census. The growth, 4.8 million new young Latinos, and a net gain of about 800,000 in the Asian Pacific Island population. So that's where the change is coming, where the growth is coming for the next America we're taking a look at. And when you compare the US to Nevada, you can see that Nevada shares the sort of shrinkage in the population of young whites, but it's having a big increase percentage-wise in the increase of young African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Pacific Islanders. So what's going on in the United States is going on in an accelerated form here in terms of the rapidity of the demographic transformation. Does that make sense to folks? And do you see it in your lives? See it changing? So what that means is the US now is projected that just after 2040, whereas in 1980 we were about a little bit under 80% white, it's projected that by about 2042, 2043, we'll become majority people of color as a nation. Now, this will be a big thing for the country, but of course it's happened before. It happened in California. In fact, the demographic change the US is going through now between 2000 and 2050 is basically the demographic change that California went through between 1980 and 2000. So that 20-year period in California's history is sort of what the US is about to go through. I always think of California as America fast forward. I know people in the rest of the country don't like to think that, but we're very confident of ourselves. So, or in Spanish, there's a great expression in Spanish. Those of you who speak Spanish know this, se cree muy muy, which literally means he believes himself to be very, very, which means Californians are just kind of conceited, right? We are the future. But actually, that demographic change was very interesting because that demographic change in California was accompanied by fights around, was accompanied by the LA civil unrest, fights around immigration, Prop 187, fights around affirmative action, all sorts of racialized politics, which have actually given way to much more consensus building now as the demographic change has slowed and we're sort of coasting into a particular kind of equilibrium. But the bumpiness is occurring in the rest of the country. And that bumpiness is something we're all going to have to wind up learning to deal with. I remember when California became majority minority because some demographers said, you know, they do that. Rob is a demographer, so I'm sure he did this at some point actually, where they go, the 300 millionth baby was born today. His name is Jose. He lives in Henderson, and you're like, how did you know that, right? So on December 15th, 1999 in California, I kept getting phone calls from reporters all day long because some demographer said, we're majority minority. And they kept saying, the reporters, we're majority minority, we're majority minority, we're majority minority. What's it mean? What's it mean? What's it mean? A tone of anxiety in their voice. So finally, like any good academic, I said, I don't know. But we're having a salsa party at my house tonight to celebrate. In the spirit of the new California, everyone's invited. They just need to learn a new step. And that's part of what we're doing is learning a new step. In particular, what does it mean to be in a world in which all of us are a minority, and all of us then have to practice coalition building with other groups in order to find some common ground. And what's interesting about Nevada and Las Vegas is you're getting there early. That is, for Nevada as a whole, you will become majority people of color sometime between 2010 and 2020. And for Las Vegas, also roughly a little bit before that. I guess you're already now majority people of color. So that's an interesting thing. That means that everybody has to say Las Vegas the right way. Paradiso, right, instead of paradise. And don't worry, Henderson will always be Henderson. So what's interesting about this, too, if you look at this map, and we'll get to it in a little bit more detail, and this is something Rob and his colleagues at Brookings in particular have done a very good job of describing, is that our vision of demographic change is generally that what's going on is that demographic change, I mean, first our vision of demographic change is that it's all occurring in California, right? Like California is about to become 150% minority, and that's what the demographics will be for the country. But the other thing that goes on is people tend to think that the demographic change is happening just in our central cities, but in fact, throughout the United States, the places that are becoming the most diverse, the most rapidly, are America's suburbs. And you actually saw this in the last couple of weeks with all of the conflict in Ferguson, right? Ferguson, which was 70% white just 30 years ago, is now 70% African American. It's an inner-ring suburb of St. Louis. And those, I just went and did a talk at the Open Society Foundation, and I started by saying, I want you to imagine a suburb that's about 25,000 people, pretty close to a central city, was constructed for a white population working in industry, and has now undergone rapid demographic transformation and finds itself with a police department that's essentially making money for the city by fining its residents for various things, which of course is Maywood, California, right, as well as Ferguson, right? That is, this is happening all over the country with lots of suburbs not used to this demographic change, and that's the kind of thing that's happening here in the Vegas area as well. One very interesting thing about Las Vegas is that you're continuing to see an increase in your share of foreign born. So while it's stabilizing in the more traditional receiving places like California and New York, et cetera, what's happening is that immigrants are spilling over into new locations. Some of them actually coming from places like LA, some of them actually now entering directly into places like Las Vegas, and also entering directly into America's suburbs. And what that means is that Nevada is now, I think, the 5th most Latino state in the United States. So while there's been a tendency to think of the most Latino states as being California and New Mexico and Texas and Florida, Nevada is kind of right behind that group. And actually, if you move up there, you'll see a whole series of states you might not expect, like Idaho and Oregon, at Utah. Utah is very good, Utah being now the 11th most Latino state in the United States. So this demographic change is occurring all over, and one way to take a look at that is to look at maps that basically show you the demographic change. So this is from a project we're doing with PolicyLink, and a little bit of an advertisement. In 2 weeks, my program for environmental regional equity and PolicyLink are going to be releasing a new website that's called the National Equity Atlas. And the National Equity Atlas is for the 150 top metropolitan areas in the United States and for all of the states in the District of Columbia, going to have a lot of the data that I'm presenting here. That is, it's going to have maps, demographic changes, projections, a lot of stuff on jobs, housing imbalance, a lot of stuff on whether or not the labor force is prepared for the future. So in about 2 weeks, you will never have to hear me talk again. You'll just be able to go to a website and get all of this. But in the meanwhile, this is a map that we did, and this is for the counties of the United States. It's a very easy map to interpret. The browner the county, the browner the county. So the darkest shade, you can laugh, it's cool. The darkest shade is greater than 50% people of color. The sort of orangey shade is 40 to 50% people of color. And that turns out, just like it's often thought of as a tipping point in a neighborhood, it seems to be a tipping point in a county too. Once you hit there, you're probably going over to being majority people of color. In 1980, the country looked like most people still think the country looks. A black belt of the South heading up into DC, the borderlands of Texas with Mexico, the Native American and Hispanic areas of New Mexico and Arizona, some of the Native American areas in the Dakotas. In California, in 1980, the only county that was majority people of color was Imperial County, right on the border with Mexico. Los Angeles hadn't crossed that threshold yet. In fact, the demographic change in LA is just so amazing because in 1960, Los Angeles was one of the country's whitest major cities. You wouldn't think of it like that now. So this is what the country looked like in 1980, 1990. Note the change is starting to happen mostly in California, in 2000, and then in 2010. And this is what's projected for the next 30 years, 2020, 2030, follow your own state, 2040. So huge demographic change. And there's a couple things to notice about it. One is that the areas that are remaining light in terms of the shade, that is less people of color, are areas that are either sparsely populated or a lot of the industrial Midwest where there's not a lot of economic vitality. And the second thing to notice about that is that if you have friends or relatives that are in some of those lighter areas now and they don't have a good taqueria near them, tell them, don't worry, one is coming. And again, the really interesting thing about this is that some of this demographic change has been the most profound, really, in America's suburbs. So this is the Las Vegas region, where you can see that it was really North Las Vegas here that was really significantly people of color. You can see the huge expansion between 1980 and 2010. And actually, there's more dramatic changes in other locations. So if you look at a place like Denver, which is fascinating, the Denver core is actually whitening as there's this kind of movement of the creative class downtown, gentrification, et cetera, and it's the suburbs that are experiencing a lot of diversity. I don't know about you, but the Aurora shooting, which was a tragedy, made me realize one thing, much like Ferguson. When I looked at the pictures of those kids from Aurora, which I always thought of as being a white suburb because it was, and you realize that they were all from, there were African Americans and Latinos and whites and Asians all hanging out together in that theater, that Aurora as a suburb had changed dramatically. So that's happening in Denver. It's happening in Los Angeles, where the hottest places where there's growth is actually in downtown Los Angeles. There's a lot of displacement and people are moving into suburbs. It's happening in Seattle, where all the stuff is happening in terms of demographic change, south of the city of Seattle in its suburbs. So this is a big phenomenon going on around the country. So, let me get a drink of water and ask a question. So was that some of that stuff interesting? Okay. Let me reassure you that none of that is as interesting as this statistic. This has to do with the median age of the various populations. And so this is from 2012. Median age means half older, half younger. So the gap's a little bigger in Nevada, but the median age for non-Hispanic whites in the United States is 43, half older, half younger. The median age for Asians, 36. The median age for African Americans, 33. For Native Americans and Pacific Islanders in the low 30s. And for Latinos, the median age is 28. 43, 28. 15 years. It's a generation gap, right? And it helps to explain two things. One is it helps to explain our demographic change. Because when you're 28, you're in prime family formation age. When you're 43, you think you're in prime family formation age, right? I mean, you may well be, Godspeed, you could consider a sports car too. So it helps to explain change this generation gap actually helps to explain a little bit of our politics as well. And you'll note that in Nevada, you actually have a bigger gap in terms of the age structure of the white and Latinos in the state. But for example, the state that has the biggest generation gap, which means the whitest old and the brownest young, is, what do you think? I like that. California, Utah, keep going. Arizona, you're right. Arizona. And think about first the racial politics in Arizona around immigration and around ethnic studies in the schools. Then think about the fact that in the last 5 years, Arizona had the third sharpest cuts in per student education spending, had the largest, biggest cuts in university percentage-wise spending for the public university, and the biggest increase in public tuition. And this relationship is not a relationship that is surprising. This is a map which shows you spending per child. That's a darker color. And I'm going to flip it to a map that shows you the generation gap. And one of the things you're going to see is that a remarkable photo negative, which is where the gap is biggest between the old and the young, spending on the future, that is education, is the lowest. Does that make sense? And lest you think, which you might, that this is simply a visual trick of the map. We did a multivariate cross-section time series regression in which we controlled for all the other variables that predict spending, including revenue capacity, general age structure, et cetera. And we still found in that time series cross-section fixed effects regression that the generation gap had a statistically significant impact on lowering the spending per child. And if you took graduate statistics, you'll understand what I just said. And if you didn't, all it means is I'm right. So that is that this gap has real consequences in our politics where an older generation doesn't see itself in a younger generation. And part of this planning that you're doing for the future has to be about reconnecting the generations, because if the generations are not reconnected, then the idea of making the kind of investments and sacrifices that need to occur now to prepare is really something that's going to be a little bit hard to get at. And all of this is occurring in the context of growing inequality in the United States. This is a graph that shows you the share of income, the blue line, going to the top 1%. You'll note two peaks, 1928, right before the Great Depression, and 2007, right before the Great Recession. And I'll talk a little bit later about why people don't think that's a coincidence. When people see this growing inequality in the United States, one of the things that they say is, well, perhaps we ought to worry about that, but inequality in the United States is pretty acceptable for two reasons. One is the fact that our inequality is accompanied by a lot of mobility, right? So we might be unequal, but at least people can get ahead over time. What's interesting is that there's research that's showing us that, in fact, this is a rain on the horizontal axis, income inequality, and on the vertical axis, what I'm calling class stickiness, because the official term is intergenerational earnings elasticity, and nobody understands that. What class stickiness means is the likelihood that if you start in the lowest quintile, you'll end up in the lowest quintile versus being able to move forward. And it turns out that there's actually, and I'm sorry, this is an old map, there's only 2 countries that have less mobility than the United States. The United Kingdom, which has a queen, right? And the other one, which is not up there, is Italy, which has Silvio Berlusconi, which is kind of like having a queen, right? So we are, we have a lot less mobility. In fact, one country, again, I'm sorry, I seem to have put the wrong chart up there, that has more mobility than us and less inequality is Canada. So in particular, when I'm talking in the Midwest, I tell people that if they want to pursue the American dream, they should move to Canada because there's more mobility up there. So our argument about why inequality is okay, number one, is that somehow inequality might be good because there's a lot of mobility, people do move around, and so it's sort of random chance where you are in this spectrum. The other thing, and I'm just going to say a word about the fact that there's persistent racial gaps, and you can see this here in Nevada as well. These are the share of families living below 150% of the poverty line. Poverty line is so low, economists these days are trying to adjust for housing costs, et cetera, by considering something a little bit higher than the poverty line. You could see big racial differentials between whites, blacks, and Latinos in Nevada, and certainly also in the Las Vegas metropolitan area as well. But what's interesting, this just shows you where the location of poor folks are, which is familiar to you. Let me move back here. I'll get to the second thing about inequality in a second, but because what this suggests takes a little bit of time, but this is kind of worth the time, and I guess I have a pointer, so that's pretty magic. So there's a lot of inequality. You got a lot of racial inequality here, and you've got a recipe for more inequality. Because if you look at the educational attainment of adults, you've got about 22% of whites who've got a BA or more. That's about that was 27%. About 16% of African Americans have a BA, only about 8% of Latinos, about 35% of Asian Pacific Islanders. If you look at the bottom here, the gray, people who lack less than a high school degree, 41% of Latinos of working age do not have a high school degree. So if you combine that with some data that you've also got on your dropout rates, where your dropout rates for African Americans and Latinos from high school is pretty similar, but the dropout rates for the Latino population are on the order of 26%. That's a recipe for continuing inequality in the future. Less preparation for what might be the good jobs that might emerge. So I'm going to jump over this to get to this. So the first thing I said when people talk about inequality and say that it's somewhat justifiable is that there's a lot of mobility. Where people are arrayed doesn't really mean where they're going to stay. The second thing that people say about inequality, and it's been something very dearly held by the economics profession, is that inequality might be distasteful morally, or politically you might not like it, but at least it's good for economic growth. That is that if there's more income for the folks at the top, they're high saving, they're high investing, that's going to generate growth. If there's more inequality, there's lots of incentives, that's going to generate productivity. Here's what's interesting about economists, and I can say this because I have a PhD in economics. Someone once said about economists that if you took all the economists in the world and laid them end to end, they still couldn't reach a conclusion. Someone else said, and I thought more prophetically, that if you took all the economists in the world and laid them end to end, it would be a good thing. 30 years ago, there was a poll taken of economists, and economists notoriously disagree on lots of things. So they tried to figure out the one thing they would agree on. And the one thing that 90% of economists agreed on 30 years ago was that when you raised the minimum wage, unemployment results. And then in 1995, David Card and Alan Krieger did a book called Myth and Measurement, looking at the raises in the minimum wage in New Jersey and California, and showed that actually, economists are really good by saying, well, that's how that works in practice, but how does it work in theory? So that in theory it should cause unemployment, right? But it turned out that when you raise the minimum wage in New Jersey and in California, it didn't cause that employment, even amongst teen workers working in fast food restaurants. And then there began a whole new wave of new minimum wage research that's gone on for the last 10 years, which has basically showed that modest increases in the minimum wage don't actually result in an increase in unemployment. And they don't because when you raise the minimum wage, a couple things happen. One, what most people normally think, minimum wage employees have more money, they spend it, that stimulates the economy. But there's something else, which is kind of interesting. My cousin's first job was a minimum wage job at a gas station back in the day when people used to actually pump gas. You remember that? And one time, someone asked his boss, what do you pay these guys? And the boss said, well, I pay them the minimum wage and everything they can steal. And I used to tank up there, so I know that that was an accurate assessment of what happened at that gas station. That is, when you pay people really low wages, they don't work really hard, right? When you pay them a little bit better, morale goes up, productivity goes up, absenteeism goes down, there's better matching between employers and employees. It's the reason why there's not a lot of loss of employment for the increases in the minimum wage that we've seen, and that's what's given a lot of wind to the sails of doing this. There's another thing that's happened, and it has to do in the field with this long-held shibboleth about the relationship between inequality and economic growth and how that's changing as well. Some of it comes from this book. Not a lot of it, actually. I'll explain in a second. How many of you have heard of this book by Thomas Piketty, Capital? Okay, how many of you read this book? Okay, there's an interesting statistic for you. This is, according to Amazon, the most unread book they've ever sold. Because how many of you use Kindle? You know they can like relocate the page you're at, right? So everybody gets to about page 25 and goes, why did I buy this, right? Because it's like hard to read, right? But Capital actually got very popular at the beginning of this year, mostly because it squared with people's concerns about too much inequality in the United States. And there's been another body of research which has been trying to take a look at the relationship between inequality and economic growth. Now, I've contributed to it, and I'll talk a little bit about our own work in a second. But you don't have to believe me. Believe that well-known left-leaning organization, the Cleveland Federal Reserve, which did a study of metropolitan regions in the United States, much the size of Cleveland. And they found that things that matter for economic growth are things like an anchor university, diversified industrial structure, educated population, things you'd expect. But what they found, a bit to their surprise, was places that had more inequality, that had more racial segregation, and had more gaps between city and suburb in terms of poverty experience, actually had slower economic growth. And just 2 years ago, the International Monetary Fund, looking at sustainability of growth over time for countries, found out that the single largest factor that was a drag on economic growth was initial income inequality. It turns out that when there's a lot of income inequality, people tend not to invest in basic public education. They tend to escape to private education. It turns out that when there's a lot of inequality, there's a lot of political squabbling about how to divide things rather than how to burden share or how to collaborate to produce growth, because everybody feels like they're going to benefit. Now, we've contributed to that research with some work which I won't describe in too much detail, but I mean, even Standard & Poor's has released a report showing that inequality is actually causing slower growth and suggesting that the United States do something about it. And we actually deal with this a lot in our work with PolicyLink and also in the book that I believe someone kindly mentioned, Just Growth, which, by the way, you could buy and make the second most unread book on Amazon. Because I do care whether you read it, but I mostly care if you buy it. So please do. And for those of you who are not readers, not to worry. It's about to be made into a major motion picture in which I will be portrayed by Antonio Banderas. So I'm very excited. So this is suggesting that there's a whole new logic to dealing with equity and making equity part of our regional planning, which is that if we reduce these income disparities, if we reduce these geographic differences between folks, we are actually contributing to prosperity. That is, inclusion and prosperity can go hand in hand. Now, not always, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I close. Why is it so important now? This is a really cool chart for two reasons. One, it's the only animated one I have. And that itself is really cool. But what this is what demographers call an age pyramid. And an age pyramid is what you might think, which is that we always think about the fact we've got a lot of young people, and that as we move up through the age structure, right, and move to the very old, the herd thins out, right? People pass away. And what you'll note here, and we'll catch it, is that in 1950, the United States really had what looked like an age pyramid, a big bulge at the bottom. That's the baby boomers, and you can watch them going through over time as they get older. They're a little bit like a volleyball going through a snake, right? Kind of hard to digest, really. But the thing that I think you should notice from this, most significantly, is that the age pyramid is becoming an age cylinder. There's less people being born. There's less immigrants filling the workforce in the middle because immigration is slowing down. And there's more old people surviving a longer period of time. And what that means is that when people talk about our kids having as good a standard of living as us, which implies that they're as productive as us, that's not enough. They've got to be more productive than us. I don't know the ratio in Nevada, but in California, it's predicted that in the next 20 years, the dependency ratio, the number of old folks each person of working age will be supporting, will be going up by 60%. So each person in the labor force needs to be far more productive than ever. So what I'm trying to tell you essentially is that a compelling case for including equity in our economic planning is emerging. It's getting an empirical basis, it's got some demographic wind at its back, and it's important. There's policies to get there, workforce strategies, transportation strategies, housing strategies. There's many of those laid out in the plan, the draft plan that I had a chance to take a look at, that I think are quite intelligent, quite forceful, will do a good job in terms of thinking about, I mean, the state's not doing very well in terms of educational achievement. I think you're about 48th in the country, competing with California, 50th, way to go. Someone said 51st, boy, that's bad. So there's a lot of challenges moving forward that you need to address, and we can talk a little bit more in the question and answer about the actual policies that will get you there. But what I want to suggest to you is that we know a lot of that. I mean, we know that if we put pre-K in place, people do better later on. And by the way, I do want to say one really important thing, which is that the idea that inclusion and prosperity can go together is certainly a challenge to folks in the business community who thought that equity is something you do later. But for those of you in the social justice community, it's a challenge as well. Because what it means is not everything that's fair actually produces economic growth. More community colleges generates economic growth and inclusion. More welfare doesn't really. It just puts more people on welfare. Pre-K, we know, makes a huge difference moving people forward. The thing we need to find in our planning is what we call just growth sweet spots. That is places where inclusion and prosperity really do come together, places where we can make those investments. There's policies that we know work. We know that pre-K works. We know that one thing that's going to be very important for Nevada is that you cannot ignore your adult immigrant population and their skilled training needs. You know, we often, when we think about education and getting people ready for the workforce, we tend to think about kids, right? Like we need to do pre-K, we need to make sure that K through 12 is working well, et cetera. And I think that we do that because kids are cuter than day laborers. But day laborers are someone's parents, right? And when they do a little better, their apartment is a little bigger and there's a place for a kid to study. We found recently that when you raise the minimum wage, one thing that happens is people stop having second jobs. They actually don't even change their household income that much. They just drop the second job, and they're able to go to all that parent engagement stuff that we know is critical to the kid's success. So we need to be thinking about those kind of strategies as well. But I assure you that there's no limit to the creativity you have around the strategies. The limit is whether or not we can connect together in a single vision for the region. And in doing that, I think it's important to understand a couple of things, and then I'll close, because I think that's okay, time-wise. To understand something about this next generation coming up, because it's really going to be important here in Nevada. How many of you work with young people? Great. So I think this will resonate with you. It certainly resonates with my own work with young people and the polling data. Here's what's interesting. This generation coming up, they ought to be angry, right? The school systems are failing them. They're over-policed and over-incarcerated. Some large swath of them live in terror that their parents are going to be removed by immigration authorities. They ought to be angry, but they're aspirational. They're aspirational about what they can make for themselves and about how they can change the world. When you do polling, the groups that are the most optimistic in the United States right now are young African Americans and Latinos. If you look at the data, they have no reason to be. But they're the most optimistic. And one of the things we need to change is to appeal not so much to their anger as to their aspirations and weave a positive vision that brings young people in and helps to reconnect generations as well. The second thing I want to leave you with is that we really can't think about equity and inclusion as sort of add-ons that we do later. They're actually really fundamental to actually getting things right, making sure that we get the future right in terms of planning, making sure we get the economy right. These are things that have to be up front and not something that gets left behind. And I guess the final thing I will leave you with is the following. Las Vegas is a unique place. I mean, really, having a liquor store in the baggage claim is just amazing. But people come here with great dreams and hopes about what they're going to make for themselves. And when I think about that, I'm kind of reminded of a story Lisa may have heard before, but I'll tell again, which is some years ago, a couple years ago, my dad passed away, but 5 years before that, my mom got sick, and it was a very sudden thing. And it looked like she was going to go in about 2 weeks, and that's really what happened. And during that period of time, I was living up north in Northern California. My dad was in LA, but I kept coming down and spending time with him. And because I was living far away, I was worried about what would happen to him. He was 90 years old. And so I kept saying to him from the beginning, Dad, you should think about having somebody come in and take care of you, help you out. And he didn't want to talk about it. And then, I raised it again, and he didn't want to talk about it. And on the day of her funeral, as we were driving back to his apartment, my wife and daughter in the back seat, I said again to my dad, 90 years old at the time, Dad, you should have somebody, you should think about having somebody come in and just kind of help out since I live so far away. And he looked at me and he said, I want to try it on my own for a while. I want to see what my potential is. And my wife kind of slapped me up the side of my head because what I realized was, and I think I can identify very much with this young man at this table. We were talking a little bit about fathers and what they taught us, that what my dad had taught me my whole life was, to strive to realize your potential. And it was what I had taught my children, is what I expected them to do, is what I expected myself to do. And the challenge I leave you with is Las Vegas. People come here to realize their dreams. You've got these tremendous assets of a vibrant, young population, an influx of immigrants with tremendous amount of energy, a skilled and entrepreneurial group that really wants to contribute, these chambers that are as interested in equity as they are in moving business forward, a united way that's actually gotten the message that pathways out of poverty is something that should be guiding people, and change, not charity, is really the beacon. And a framework in which I think there's an increasing acceptance that it's no longer enough to think about individuals and how they beat the odds. We need to be thinking about systems and how we change the odds so that we have more and more success stories over time. Las Vegas, realize your potential. Thank you.